Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Loving obeisances unto the Supreme Being Vasudeva, who is everything there is. Janmadyasya yato anvayaditaratascha artheshu abhignaswarat tene brahmahridaya adikavaye muhyanti yat surayah tejo vari mridam yatha vinimayo yatra trisargo mrisha dhamna svena sada nirastakuhakam satyam param dhimahi. We meditate upon the transcendent absolute being from whom springs forth this universe. He is present in all that exists and yet distinct from everything. He is fully conscious and totally independent. He revealed to the first seer Brahma the import of Vedic wisdom. The material creation made of threefold gunas appears in him as though real like water in a mirage. Being eternally self effulgent, he is ever free of the illusion Maya of the material world. We meditate upon him, the Supreme Being. Nigamakalpataror galitam phalam shukamukad amrutadrava sanyutam pivada bhagavatam rasamalayam muhuraho rasika bhuvi bhavukaha. O devotees who relish a taste for divine love, Bhagavatam is the fully ripened fruit of the wish-yielding tree of Vedas, flowing as immortal nectar from Shuka Brahma Rishi. Go on drinking this sweet nectar day after day. So we are now in the 9th chapter of the 4th Skandha of Srimad Bhagavatam, and we are in the famous Dhruva Charitram, or the story of the great devotee Dhruva. So we saw in the last chapter how Dhruva went to the forest by Yamuna upon being insulted by his stepmother and engaged in great penance according to the instruction of Narada Muni, the great Devarishi, and thereby he was, because of his intense tapas, Bhagavan himself was pleased, and he told all the devatas who were shaking at the intensity of the tapas of Dhruva that they need not worry, for it is his intense devotee who is doing tapas, and Bhagavan said, I will take care. So now Maitreya continues the narration. Bhagavan, the Supreme Being, Vasudeva, he took upon his vehicle Garuda, the famous eagle, to Madhuvana, the forest by Yamuna, where Dhruva was in this penance. And he reached there, and Dhruva, who was thus far in intense meditation in yoga, by which he was beholding the form of the Supreme Being as described by Narada in the lotus of his heart, he was now able to behold the same form without. So what he was perceiving within, suddenly he was struck by, as if a flash of lightning, he opened his eyes and he saw the same form standing in front of him, the Supreme Being having appeared there in the transcendental form as described by Narada. And struck with awe at this wonderful darshan form, Dhruva felt awed and he fell prostrating on the ground like a stick. It says dandavat, as a stick would fall down, his whole body fell down completely. This is the right way to offer namaskar, pranam, by making the whole body fall down like a stick. That's why it's called dandavat. And he gazed at the Supreme Lord with his eyes, as described earlier how to take darshan. He gazed upon the Supreme Lord from the lotus feet all the way to his beautiful smile. He looked at him like he would drink him with his eyes. He wanted to hug him with his arms, and he was so completely overawed. And Sri Hari, who is in the heart of all beings and therefore in Dhruva too, appeared in this form, and he was so pleased to see the intense tapas of the devotee, and now his great joy at having got the darshan. And he saw that this young boy, who was only 5 years old, was dumbstruck and he couldn't even open his mouth because of the immensity of the vision. So, Bhagavan, out of his grace, it is said, he touched his cheek with his conch shell. So, Bhagavan has 4 arms, it is said, with 4 various instruments, one conch shell, one Sudarshana chakra, one with the mace, the gada, and one with the lotus flower, Shankha Chakra Gada Padma. So, with the Shankha or the conch shell, he touches his cheeks, and the conch shell is none other than the Vedas itself. It represents all of wisdom, and therefore, by being touched with this conch, he was completely blessed now with divine speech as well. And Dhruva now addressed the Supreme Being with prayers which are the most beautiful prayers, some of the most often quoted prayers of Srimad Bhagavatam. He said, O Bhagavan, I hail you as the wielder of all potencies who, entering my very self, entering my very heart, has awakened speech as well as all organs of senses and action. So, every sense, the 5 senses of perception and the 5 senses of action, are all activated by the presence of the Supreme Being as pure consciousness in the heart. And so, Dhruva says, and this prayer, this particular verse is so often quoted, योऽन्तः प्रविश्य मम वाचमिमां प्रसुप्तां सञ्जीवयत् अखिलशक्तिधरस्वधाम्ना अन्यांश्च हस्तचरणश्रवणत्वगादीन् प्रणान् नमो भगवते पुरुषाय तुभ्यम्. This is the verse that says, Bhagavate Purushaya Tubhyam. O Supreme Lord, the glorious person, I offer my obeisance unto you, who is the wielder of all potencies, and shining within my heart, make all my senses function. Then he goes on to say, it is you alone, O Lord, who evolved the cosmic intelligence, the Mahat Tattva, and from this through Maya, which comprises 3 gunas, you have taken all the various forms, the infinite forms, and not only made the forms but also entered these forms as their inner controller and presiding over the senses and thereby appearing as many even though one. So we have seen the whole process of creation many times, and Dhruva beautifully summarizes all of this in one verse. He says, the cosmic form, which is the principle of cosmic intelligence, first Mahat Tattva, which then evolves all the 3 gunas, and through that all the elements, and through that all the various beings, and then entering all the beings along with their senses as their inner controller and activating them, and thereby appearing as infinitely diverse when in fact there is only one. So he says, just as fire is present in various logs of wood, and all the logs of wood are in essence fire, because when we burn wood, all that remains is the ashes, the whole wood burns. So all logs of wood are essentially fire, and yet they appear different. Similarly, all beings are essentially the Supreme Being, pure consciousness, though they appear different. He says, therefore, how can your lotus feet, which is sought even by liberated beings, how can one forget them if one is conscious of your benevolence? He says, Tasyapa Vargya Sharanam Tavapada Moolam Vismaryate Kritavida Katham Arthabandho. Arthabandho means one who is friend of the afflicted. O friend of the afflicted, O friend of everyone who is having any kind of suffering, true refuge of all, how can one forget your lotus feet then? Because this is the source of all potencies. Only because of your own Maya do people get bewildered, and thereby, even though you are a wish yielding tree that can grant all desires, they ask for petty pleasures of the senses. He says the bliss that is enjoyed by meditating upon your lotus feet and by hearing your stories is not even found in merging in Brahman, which is blissful in essence. So, the essence of pure Brahman or pure consciousness, which is all bliss, it's called Satchit Ananda, is full of eternal bliss. And here Dhruva says that even that bliss is less than the bliss of serving you as a devotee. So, this is the mood of a devotee, that being a devotee and serving all other forms of Bhagavan has a sweetness that is not found even in being completely merged in the pure consciousness. So it is equivalent to being in deep sleep, for instance, where one is completely merged in the state of bliss, when there is no dreams and when there is no activity of the mind. One is merged in pure bliss, and while one is waking up, if one is in waking state and one is blessed to be engaged in conscious devotion, in conscious meditation, in conscious satsang, engaging with others who are in the same mood of devotion, this is of greater sweetness than even being merged in the pure bliss in deep sleep naturally. And similarly, Dhruva says, even better than being merged in samadhi is to be in the company of devotees and to hear the stories. And therefore, he says, may I enjoy the intimate fellowship of exalted souls, exalted devotees who possess a pure heart and are constantly surrendered to you, because that is the easiest way to cross the ocean of birth and death. So we have seen this over and over again in Bhagavatam. Kapila also began his very essence of teachings by saying all realization begins with satsang. It is through satsang, through association with great devotees, that one is able to develop devotion, wisdom, and detachment, bhakti, jnana, vairagya. Therefore, Dhruva also says, it is only through cultivating fellowship of those who are your pure devotees that one can completely be free of the fear of one's own death or the death of one's relations, such as sons, spouse, or loss of wealth, etc. So, normally people are always worried about either their own mortality or the fear of losing their loved ones or the fear of losing their possessions. And all these fears are, of course, deep rooted because of the false sense of attachment with the body. So Dhruva says, one who is completely surrendered unto you and who always revels in fellowship of devotees in satsang, he is very effortlessly removed of these fears. He loses these fears of his own death or the death of his relations, because he is always in the company of your devotees who constantly pour the eternal bliss that never leaves, because that is the very nature of being. He says, one can see your gross form just by looking at this universe. All the animals, trees, mountains, birds, reptiles, human beings, everything is a representation of your cosmic intelligence, Mahat Tattva. But your pure self, pure consciousness is not something that can be easily known by anyone, because it transcends all speech. It cannot be either known or expressed. It is simply a state of being. You are the supreme being. And then he addresses the Lord by saying, you are the supreme being who is all there is at the end of dissolution. When the whole universe dissolves, you abide in yoga nidra, in the sleep of samadhi, containing a seed all of the universe that comes forth again in the next cycle. This vision has been given in many instances in Bhagavatam, very famously as the small baby Mukunda holding the seed of the whole universe in his belly and sleeping on a leaf of a banyan tree. So, the same way, here also it is said that you are in Yoga Nidra, in the eternal sleep of Samadhi, and from you the whole creation comes forth cycle after cycle. He says, therefore, you are the eternally free, all pure, all knowing self. It's again a very beautiful verse. He describes all the qualities of Bhagavan. He says, you are eternally free, all pure, all knowing, self of all, unchanging, most ancient being, possessed of all divine attributes, controller of the three gunas, witness of all the states of the mind, presiding over all sacrifices, and ever distinct from the individual being apparently caught in pleasure and pain. So he says, Tvam nityamukta parishuddha vibuddha atma kutastha adi purusho bhagavan trayadhishah yad buddhyavastita अखंडितया स्वदृष्ट्या दृष्टा स्थितावधिमखो व्यतिरिक्त आsse. He says, the very first verse of our Bhagavatam also says this. He appears as the whole universe and yet he is distinct from everything, being unaffected. So he says, you are the eternal, ever pure, most ancient self of all that appears as everything and yet remains separate from it, unaffected. And therefore, he says, you are the supreme Brahman and you are the cause of the universe, indivisible, with no beginning or end, and purely blissful in character and with no change. And I surrender unto you. This is how he concludes his prayer. He says, Tad Brahma Vishwabhavam Ekam Anantam Adyam Ananda Matram Avikaram Aham Prapadye. Every word is significant. Vishwabhavam, source of the universe, Ekam, one, Anantam, infinite, Adyam, without any beginning, Ananda Matram, pure bliss, Avikaram, without any change, Aham Prapadye, to you I surrender. And then Dhruva says, you know whatever is desired by your devotees and you bestow whatever is necessary for them and you take care of them. I am so gratified by beholding you in this form. So with this glorious prayer, Dhruva wonderfully glorifies the Supreme Being. And then Maitreya continues by saying, the Supreme Lord, Bhagavan, who is fond of his devotees, listen to these praises, these prayers. And then he said, I know the cherished desire of your heart, O Kshatriya boy. So this is very significant because when Dhruva was touched by Bhagavan with the conch shell, he uttered these wonderful prayers. But Dhruva came with a Kshatriya spirit, as Narada also noticed in the last chapter. He has the spirit of Kshatriya, the resoluteness, which was triggered by the insult given by his stepmother. And therefore he had a seed of desire because of that he has to prove his stepmother wrong. And he said, I will come back only after I am able to ascend the highest position that makes sure that my stepmother learns from it. So there is a certain resoluteness in him, even though he didn't express it because he was touched by Bhagavan's conch and he expressed the highest prayer. So now Bhagavan says, I know the cherished desire of your heart, and therefore I bestow upon you, I give you the lasting and effulgent abode that is unparalleled, and this will be the center of the whole celestial space, the stellar sphere, around which all planets will revolve. So this is why Dhruva is granted what is called Dhruva Nakshatra, which is the North Star or the pole star we see. So the North Star remains fixed. Dhruva, the word itself, means that which is stable and fixed. And so Dhruva Nakshatra is that star which is ever fixed in the sky, around which the various planetary configurations, stars, including the seven stars representing the seven rishis, the Sapta rishis, which is the Big Dipper, all of them keep moving, whereas the fixed star, that's why it is the north, and even now we can look at it to determine the geographical north. And so Bhagavan says, you will be having this as your eternal abode, Dhruva Nakshatra, and it will always be known by you. So then, in effect, what Bhagavan has granted him is a position even greater than his father or his grandfather. His grandfather is Swayambhuva Manu, who's the first king, and his father is Uttanapada. And because he wanted to ascend the throne of the king by going to the lap of the king, he was insulted. Now he has been given a star in the sky as his abode, which is greater than any earthly kingdom. So, and then also Bhagavan says, after your father retires, you will anyway become the king even on this earth for a long time, rule in righteousness, and then you will finally retire. Your half brother Uttama, this is the son of Suruchi, his stepmother, so his stepbrother Uttama. He says he will lose his life in a hunting expedition. His mother Suruchi will also die eventually, and you will rule very righteously. And after that, after doing a lot of yajna, which is dear to me, you will give a lot of charity and do all kinds of righteous activities in dharma. And then, having enjoyed blessings in this life, you will finally fix your thought exclusively on me and reach my divine abode. So, thus glorified, and thus having promised Dhruva an eternal abode in his own realm, the Supreme Lord, who has Garuda on his flag and his vehicle is Garuda, the divine eagle, he disappeared to his own abode, and the child Dhruva was gazing in wonder. And after Bhagavan disappeared from there, he left the place. Dhruva came back to recognizing that he had a desire in his heart when Bhagavan came. So this is a very subtle but important point that Bhagavata makes, that even a great devotee like Dhruva, even though he had such intensity with which he did tapas, and by that tapas he was able to get a direct darshan of Bhagavan, and through Bhagavan's blessings and grace he was able to utter the highest prayer, yet he had a seed of a desire, and that seed of desire was granted by Bhagavan. And so Dhruva was slightly displeased with himself that even though he attained such a great boon from Bhagavan, he had a desire in his heart, and therefore he was slightly disappointed with that aspect. So Vidura was asking, what is there to be disappointed for Dhruva? Because even if he had a desire, he was granted the highest boon by Sri Hari, and he was also given the assurance that at the end of this birth he will attain the eternal abode and ever remain in Sri Hari's contemplation as his devotee. So Maitreya replies that he said this is because Dhruva still carried some negativity in him due to the insult given by his stepmother, and therefore he did not with all his heart ask for instant liberation. And because of that, Bhagavan granted him, even though he is such a high devotee, supremely intense in his devotion and in his tapas, and he was blessed by the great Narada himself. Bhagavan said at the end of the life, you will reach the eternal abode, which is the Dhruva Nakshatra, but he will live a long life, and he knows that this long life will have many various ups and downs, and that is because he did not ask for instant and complete liberation from all his heart. So Dhruva, that is why it says, said to himself, Dhruva was now returning back to the kingdom, and he was thinking to himself, he said, in the matter of 6 months, I was able to behold the form of the Supreme Lord, which has been meditated upon by great sages, some for many lifetimes, and yet I had a slight sense of diversity in my mind. So, how unfortunate that I, in my heart, still had something petty which is bound to perish. So, he still had the slight difference between him and his stepmother and his stepbrother, and all these ideas of diversity, even though in his prayer he said that there is no diversity in you, you alone appear as everything, because that prayer was uttered by the grace of the Lord when he touched him. But in his heart there was still a slight seed of diversity. So Dhruva himself says, my judgment was perverted because I had this seed, and that's why, because of the Maya, because of a slight perversion in my heart, I mistook my brother as my enemy, I mistook my stepmother as my enemy, and thereby I perceived duality, even though in reality it's exactly like how a sleeping man, one who dreams, he can see various projections in the dream like a lion, a snake, and other people and get afraid. But when he wakes up, there is nothing there. Similarly, this example is, of course, given always as a beautiful way to understand the whole play of Maya. When we sleep, we see a multitude of beings, diversity of all forms, which are all simply a play of the mind, and which are all pervaded by the same consciousness, and yet we identify with one particular form in the dream as me, and all other forms as other, and have desire and fear and so on. Similarly, Dhruva says, I perceive diversity through the Maya of the Lord to treat my stepmother and my stepbrother as other, and therefore, in my heart, I had a vain desire to prove them wrong, and because of that I, in my heart, had a worldly desire, and therefore I ask for something very petty. So Dhruva is a very beautiful example here for us, because on the one hand he gives the highest example of intense tapas. He is graced by the Lord as a young boy. He got the instructions of Narada, and yet because he had a small seed of worldly desire in him, or worldly memory in him, of the insult of his stepmother and the desire to prove them wrong, he had to live a long life rooted in diversity. The long life is a blessing, but being caught in diversity while living a long life is not a blessing, because it puts one through anger and through various emotions which cause suffering. And so Dhruva was given a long life, but still he had diversity that will come again and again in that long life. And at the end of the long life, he was guaranteed that he will exclusively focus his heart on the Supreme Being and realize Him and attain the eternal abode of Dhruva Nakshatra. So we will see this in the coming chapters too, where Dhruva gets caught up in anger and other emotions despite beholding the supreme divine form of the Lord. And that's what Dhruva is aware of here, that he, through this small kernel of a desire, had to go through various experiences in this life and suffering before realizing the ultimate goal, which was given by the Lord, guaranteed at the end of his life. So, having said this, Maitreya continues the narration that the King Uttanapada was waiting for Dhruva to come back because Narada had told him that he will come back. But on the other hand, he couldn't believe it, because he thought it is as miraculous as a dead man coming back. But he had faith in the words of Narada, Devarishi, and therefore he was waiting. And then one man came running giving the good news that he saw this young boy walking towards the kingdom. And so the king was mighty pleased. He gifted him this man who brought the good news, and then he mounted a beautiful chariot decked with various ornaments, surrounded by the various priests and elders, and then Vedic hymns were chanted. And by this time, the beautiful thing that happened is the stepmother Suruchi also recognized her folly, because the boy was gone for 6 months, and naturally the stepmother realized that it is her words, her piercing words of insult, that made this boy vanish. And in fact, they all thought he might have died. He had gone for 6 months. So, being affected by the guilt of her own words and realizing her folly, she also came to her senses, and therefore she also was very loving and very happy that Dhruva is coming back. So she also joined, Suniti and Suruchi both joined, and they all went in this chariot, and then they saw the boy coming, and they found him near a beautiful garden as he was coming back. And so they were all very happy, and they welcomed him. The boy came and bowed at the feet of his father. Then the stepmother Suruchi first hugs him and blesses him, may you live long, because she is now full of love for this step son of hers, Dhruva, realizing his greatness. And the step brother Uttama hugged him, and they both were very happy now to hug each other as two brothers. And everyone was pleased, because it says, Bhagavatam says, the just as water flows naturally down from wherever it is, according to gravity, the water naturally flows down. Similarly, everyone naturally gets drawn to those who are devoted to Sri Hari. So, because Dhruva is now devoted to Sri Hari completely, everybody is attracted to him. So, this attracts, as we saw already, his stepmother and his stepbrother. And of course, his mother was just waiting there, Suniti, and she was completely gratified and relieved and pleased to see her son. She hugged him tightly, and then all the people felicitated him. They all said, you are very fortunate that you've come back alive, and you've been blessed by the Lord, and you are going to be a great king for all of us. So Dhruva was placed at the head of the procession on the back of an elephant, and the king took him back into the city, the capital city called Barhishmati. And in this city, Barhishmati was decorated everywhere with all the various trees and arches and festive decorations, lights and cloths and flowers or pearls hanging, and all kinds of beautiful decorations were adorning the city, because now the young boy has come back, the prince has come back, and they were all very happy to see him. And then Dhruva lived in that excellent palace, and he lived for a while as a prince in this most opulent palace, which was full of all kinds of material opulences, as the great prince. And then finally, the royal sage Uttanapada, his father, he was so amazed to see his young boy Dhruva grow into this great prince, and he recognized that it is time for him to take over, and he also realized that it's time for him to give up and go. So the royal sage Uttanapada gave up the kingdom and retired to the forest to engage in meditation, while the son Dhruva took over as the king. This is one important aspect in Bhagavatam we see over and over again. We saw with Yudhishthira, we saw with Dhritarashtra too, encouraged by brother Vidura, and we'll see again with many kings. Every king eventually, at the right time, departs on their own. They don't cling to power till the end, but when the time is right, they give up power voluntarily, and they go to the woods to focus on the highest purpose of abiding in meditation and God realization, while giving the kingdom to a suitable, young, energetic ruler. So, this is the way of the right ruler is to not cling to power when the body is frail, but to focus at that time on God realization while giving it to the right successor to take over. So that's what King Uttanapada did. And Dhruva, the young prince blessed by the Lord, now ruled the kingdom in a very righteous way. With this chapter ends. We'll now see some of the incidents in Dhruva's life which will fulfill the prophecy given in this chapter, that Dhruva will still have various encounters and will give himself to anger and so on, and finally realize the Supreme Being as the only purpose and reach the highest goal. But in this chapter, we have seen already the most blessed prayers of Dhruva, which are often quoted and which are by the grace of Bhagavan himself, by touching him, the highest prayers that express the pure state of the Supreme Being, that is the self of all. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.